How does a banana trigger a CIA-backed coup? Do AirPods herald the arrival of a new global order? What do LED lights say about the future of humanity? I'm Ed Conway, and in each episode of my new podcast, Stuff Matters, I take an object, crack it open, and reveal the world-shaping forces hidden inside. This is economics told through the things we think we understand. Search Stuff Matters on your podcast app to listen and follow.
Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Tuesday, June the 30th. Labour has crept back into the 20s for the first time since October, according to our first poll since the resignation of Keir Starmer. Labour and Tory now level pegging on 20% each. In this week's YouGov Sky Times voting intention with Reform on 24, Lib Dems and Greens a touch squeezed on 13. My name's Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. The poll's only a small movement since last week in absolute terms, and of course it's within the margin of error, but no doubt it will come across as a boost for both of the traditional parties, as it gives them a sense that Reform UK is within touching distance and that battle is being rejoined.
Andy Burnham will be working in London today. It's unclear whether he will actually stay living in Manchester after those reports yesterday. He obviously gave his big first keynote speech in Manchester, then travelled down. Access talks with the civil service are underway between his team and Antonio Romeo's team, allowing him to road test ideas with Whitehall. So expect him to be something of a submarine for the next 20 days. Instead, it feels and falls to Keir Starmer to make what I think, Anne, is probably his last major policy announcement of his time in Number 10, and one of the most contentious, and it is also one that is 10 months late.
10 months because after all of those delays, so much talking about that on this podcast and elsewhere, we finally have the Defence Investment Plan, an announcement that has cost $15 billion and the head of one Defence Secretary. Will it have been worth the wait? More on that in the detail in just a second.
But before we do that, there was an enormously consequential moment yesterday that I actually think is worthy of putting at the top of this podcast, an actual success story in the final hour of Keir Starmer's government. And actually the spoils here go to Health Secretary James Murray, who appears to have succeeded where Wes Streeting did not, and ended the resident doctors, on-time junior doctors, BMA strike, which has been going on since March 2023. Yes, that's back in the Sunak era. Wes Streeting, the health secretary, spent his entire tenure trying to end this, issuing a 22% pay rise in July 2024 to that end. But the deal which was finally agreed in a vote yesterday means that resident doctors will now be 35.2% higher on average, have higher salaries on average compared with 4 years ago. I'm just very struck that this wasn't in the end the triumph of Golden Boy Wes Streeting, but Johnny-come-lately James Murray managed to get this one over the lines after all of the arguing and the rhetoric. What do you make of it, Anne?
Well, certainly the present health secretary, keen, I should think, to own that. In fact, one ally telling the playbook this morning the fact that James was able to end this 14-month dispute in 5 weeks isn't an accident. It's proof that his professional, calm, firm and fair approach is genuinely effective, and that made the difference. James gets things done. I think that will land like a ton of bricks, by the way, on Planet Streeting. But there are basically two views around there, because I mean it is a bit difficult for Streeting because he is in this interstice between having resigned as health secretary and borne the brunt of pretty ferocious strike and certainly a lot of determination and radicalism there among the former junior doctors, now called resident doctors, in the BMA. But I'm getting two views of this, really, if you phone around NHS managers and the like, and also some senior medics themselves. And one is that by the end of the Wes era, everybody was just getting so shirty they couldn't even agree to continue their talks, and that Streeting wanted to appear tough and have a victory. and the bones of the deal were there, but in fact it took this more cooling presence in James Murray to sort it. And of course you do, as we pointed out at the top of the podcast, you've got this sense of a new start with Andy Burnham. So I think people are just keen to tidy up some of the old feuds and see what happens in the new era. But this was a pretty narrow style outcome in the doctors' ballot. The resident doctors' ballot was 53 to 47%, or Brexity kind of outcome. And while the department is citing that headline figure that you mentioned there, Sam, on pay uplift of over 30% over the last few years, compared to a baseline that they've chosen quite carefully for that uplift to look very good, if you are perhaps on the more radical wing of the BMA, like Jack Fletcher, who's really led this revolt of the resident doctors, you're probably saying, well, this pay restoration, as they call their crusade, is not over. And he says it's not the end of the road for pay restoration. Even with our progress in the last few years, we are still a fifth behind 2008 levels of pay. It will need determination from government, he says, to keep this journey going. So in the internal politics of the Department of Health, I think you could say that James Murray leant more towards the opinion that the costs of the strike, heading towards $1 billion, were now so out of control, it was worth just stopping this, even though there is no guarantee that it will not start again. I just happened to notice that detail as I was poking around on the BMA site. And anyway, if it did come to the NHS being devolved, this would come back to local elected mayors rather than the Secretary of State for Health, although I'm still not convinced that that would be the way it turned out.
I just think the pugnacious approach by Wes Streeting, contrasting with the kind of slightly sort of voce approach of James Murray, will not have gone unnoticed. Right, we're still going to talk about the defence investment plan, but still not yet, Anne, because I'm dying to tell you about another story I came across. So do you remember yesterday I revealed that one of the reasons that the change of PM was going to happen on Monday the 20th of July rather than the week before was because the King's in Scotland and wouldn't come south? Firstly, I'm getting a little bit of pushback saying, why can't Burnham just fly north? That's what he should have agreed to. I'll leave that row to them. But more importantly, this story has prompted one listener to this podcast to shovel me a little bit more of royal chicanery that goes on in government, because the hidden wiring between the palace and government is fascinating, and much of it laid down for centuries, and we just don't know about it. So get this. Until I think the last decade or so, it was in the ministerial code that every single cabinet minister that went abroad had to inform the monarch. Now, in parts of government, this is still the case, including in the Attorney General's office, and they have to write to the King every time somebody goes abroad. I am told that in the event that one of these letters has to be written, different members of staff in the private office of the Attorney General take it in turns to write to the palace, so they can each have their own individual reply from Buckingham Palace as a little sort of souvenir of one of the things that they did in the office that day, which is a rather sort of lovely sort of custom. Now no longer, I think, laid down in statute and part of the ministerial code and legal, but a little bit of sort of ancient history that continues in our system in frankly a rather charming, if slightly old kind of way.
I think it sounds like Mauritania, doesn't it? And I'm envisaging this being written on ink and parchment. Somehow got there by means of horseman or carrier pigeon. I have to say it does hit my funny bone, because I spent the entire week and a lot of the previous one with talks about modernisation going on in the palace and among politicians, and this is where we end up. So thank you to that very engaged listener for that, which is also just a reminder that, of course, we do get some of our best ideas, or at least Sam got this one, by things that people tell us and get in touch with us about the workings of government and politics. So keep that up.
Definitely. Right, finally, here we are. The Defence Investment Plan. We kept you waiting. To be honest, Keir Starmer kept you waiting for the best part of a year. So just to remind you of the backdrop, you had the Strategic Defence Review, the Lord Robertson Review, published last summer in happier times when John Healey was the Defence Secretary, Al Carnes was the Defence Minister, and everything was meant to be fully funded. Exactly how that they were going to spend that budget was to be laid out in a defence investment plan, which was meant to come in the autumn. But by the end of last year, the military chiefs had found a whopping £28 billion black hole in the MOD budget, and the MOD wanted more money. Now, John Healey was able to wring about £13.5 billion out of the Treasury, but decided that wasn't enough and earlier this month resigned. Dan Jarvis took over, and today it appears that he will be able to confirm that he's managed to increase from 13.5 billion to 15 billion pounds, the additional amount. It's over 4 years, so it's not an annual budget, it's a capital budget, most of which we are told can be spent on drones. Now, this nudge upwards will be the source of a lot of discussion, and certainly we've got some talking points around it in a moment, but it is, of course, a proportionately tiny rise in the defence budget. So finally, we have the dip, but have things really changed, Anne? There's still a shortfall in the defence budget. The service chiefs still aren't happy in putting their name to it, as I understand it. We've still got no date when we will hit the new NATO target, and Al Khan's is still a leadership contender. What do you make of it?
I'm intrigued that you think that Al Khan's is still a leadership contender, because I wondered whether that wasn't...
In his own mind.
Oh, that was your sense of humour.
Sorry.
Oops, edit point. No, I think that's right. Al Khan's, well, he's keeping the pressure on, I think what one could say. Let's put it like that. So the response in my inbox from contacts in the NATO member states, Sama, and also in the Gulf, in fact, where there's got a lot of coverage about this in parts of the press, and particularly the defence establishment. I think it's really about that latter figure and what has happened to the Starmer commitments on the international stage to raise defence spending by a date that can be agreed and looked at and is a comparator with other countries. And that still isn't there. And that has been noticed, I think, and will be a source of a bit of unease in the run-up to the NATO summit. I think it's a bit like the framing of the end to NHS strikes, isn't it? You've got a tough, chin-jutting Secretary of State here, or had, in John Healey, a bit like Wes Streeting was with the resident doctors, who were just saying, we can't do the deal's not good enough, etc. And in John Healey's case, he simply thought the shortfall was too big, and dangerously so. He said so very clearly, if you remember, in his resignation statement. Now we have a less experienced, a more pliant successor, but well-liked figure in Dan Jarvis, who has done the deal, and that ends a standoff for the government that Keir Starmer would certainly want ended before he was out of the door. So one defence official I contacted just texted back, "It'll do for now." And I think that is the tone that I would say underpins this. Playbook today is saying, in fairness to Jarvis, he managed to secure additional front-loaded cash, made some different choices about the total package and what it should be spent on. So he probably led towards one project and away from others. But, Healey had also said that this was problematic because so much was delayed. And I think Dan Jarvis will say, well, I got you the best part of 1.5 billion moved forward. However, if you are thinking about the bigger choices, it does seem here that there's a lot of reliance on uncrewed capability in drones, i.e. things that you can do without having the expensive human, so not so many expensive humans in the mix. But there is concern, genuinely, I think, that this does not take enough account of the fact that you have to integrate that interoperability with existing capability, to use the jargon, and that is not really addressed. And just saying we'd have a lot more drones, that's what the Ukraine battlefield has become. They've done frugal innovation, all true, but that is conducted in a particular circumstance in Ukraine. Can it really bridge that gap in funding that John Healey thought was so big?
It doesn't appear so. A source has been in touch to say, look out for the fact that none of the service chiefs appear. As I was saying yesterday, I think a couple of them are on holiday. One of them might be abroad. But also one of them is pointing to a line from the Dan Jarvis speech, where he's meant to be saying, it isn't for the chiefs to support. Our job is to serve the government and implement its policies as best we can. To which my source said, you can draw your own conclusions. So yeah, I completely agree with whoever texted you, the "it will do for now" viewpoint. today is a day where I think that people are going to slightly try and rewrite history. And I know others have got this too, but I felt it was perhaps, if anything, a little bit more aggressive than others thought, because there's quite some briefing around why Dan Jarvis succeeded in getting an extra 1.5 billion. And we are being told, and I've been told, that it is in part because Dan Jarvis was simply more collaborative than John Healey. The allegation is that John Healey did not like and was not prone to direct negotiations with Rachel Reeves, preferring, where possible, to go through number 10 instead. Now, it's not that they never spoke one-on-one, although some of the sorts of accounts of conversations are fairly testy ones, and maybe that's why we are where we are. But certainly, I think that there is a sense that he wouldn't play sort of properly and was trying to use number 10 as a sort of battering ram against the Treasury. That's not a surprise if you read his letter, right? That is essentially his allegation, was that really it was the Treasury that didn't get it. So one person's not playing nicely as another person's frustration that you're not getting the answer that you want. But there is a sort of, there is something about he is a lone solo player, or he's not playing nicely, that's an edge to this briefing. And presumably is an attempt to damage John Healey as there's an imminent reshuffle, stop him getting a good job by suggesting he has flaws. It felt like an attempt at a bit of a character assassination, frankly, on him, by going for his political style. And it shouldn't be too much of a surprise, because John Healey did do grievous damage to the Starmer government, whose reputation, frankly, was harmed by the manner of his resignation, which they didn't see coming. So some tit for tat, I think, in the backdrop of today's announcement.
I think that's very incisive, because it reminds us that when you get a resignation at that level that caused the damage it did, and really was one of the final straws for getting Keir Starmer out the door, you've then got two enemy camps, really, haven't you? You've got the Treasury, where there was already tension. We knew that because John Healey was so angry about, as he saw it, the Treasury not being flexible enough and realising that he had this big hole to fill, and it was also Rachel Reeves needed to take national security more seriously. That was along the lines of the briefing from John Healey's people. And at the same time, you're right. I mean, I always saw John Healey as being a bit of a loyalist to Keir Starmer in order to get his business done. But in the end, he turned on the Prime Minister. So now you've got blowback coming from two quarters there. What I doubt in all of this, and I suppose I've said something a bit similar about the way that the doctor strike ended, was that if it was as simple as just putting in someone with a nicer manner and less of a rebarbative history in negotiations, then government would be a much easier business than in fact is. And what I think is happening at the moment is you've got a desire to bridge the Starmer era and the Burnham one, which is imminent, whatever Al Khan's decides to do or not. And that at the moment, people are more inclined to come to quick deals. Of course, if you're on the Burnham side of things, you're thinking, please, yes, don't come in with all this stuff just sitting there for me to do. I'd like to start with a clean set of priorities myself. But my sense is that in both cases, they will return quite quickly. And John Healey did know a lot. John Healey could be a bit chin-jotting, a bit difficult, but at the same time he was like that because I think he had come to see, some people say he should have seen it earlier, that the state of Britain's armed forces and our defence capability was really in a parlous state, and he wondered why he couldn't wake up the system. Now it seems to be half awake, but will that be seen to be good enough? And wherever Andy Burnham chooses to live, whichever address, Manchester, London, the world outside is going to come pressing in on him, and it won't be something he can simply farm out to others to deal with.
Of course, you're right that it isn't about personality at its root here. I suspect in part it was also about trying to teach John Healey a point. We can find more money post-resignation just to make you look bad. One of the things that's quite striking is that this is red on red, yes, but it is members of the the current administration and members and other versus people who might be in the Burnham administration. But what we haven't had a great deal of is Starmer versus Burnham, or Team Starmer versus Team Burnham. And really over the last 10 very difficult, turbulent days, there's been remarkably little of that. Now, part of that is because some people are acting as a bridge between the two sides, no doubt with an eye of what happens to them post Starmer, but also just with an eye to sort of ensuring that the current Prime Minister gets as smooth as an exit as possible. And one of those people acting as a bridge, I'm told, is Richard Hermer, the Attorney General. And he's going to try and do that a little bit more this afternoon. He's doing a speech at New Statesman Live at 2:00. And he's basically going to be making the case that Starmer's great success has been rebuilding the UK's reputation abroad. Some will agree, some will disagree, and making this country a place where world leaders come in moments of crisis, like President Zelensky. And he doesn't think this isn't because Andy Burnham, doesn't get it, but he just wants to hammer home the idea that, global leadership can help, with everything up to and including the cost of living. So just one sign that people are trying to smooth the passage, and looking after a friend when there aren't very many people doing that job. And although I think that'll change in the run up to the 20th. But I think, we're the first to call this a sort of bloodless coup. And I think quite a lot of hard work has gone on from quite a lot of people to stop what you would normally get, which is just quite a lot of tit for tat in public between an outgoing and an incoming administration. It's quite remarkable, really.
You remind me of a conversation that I had reported back to me from someone who'd spoken to Richard Hermer, also knew Keir Starmer well from legal circles, and had the conversation in which they had discussed Don't Look Back in Anger really needing to be the mood of the departing Keir Starmer and his government, and that Richard Hermer had very much lent into that, saying, yes, we have things we want to be clear that we achieved. You saw that also in comments from Starmer when he said he was going. How long will that remain bloodless, or will there be a tendency afterwards to say, I was already doing all of these things and you gave me no credit? Maybe I'm just looking on the slightly glummer side this morning, but I think you're absolutely right to pick that up. I think there is a desire to support Starmer, but also to say, let's accentuate the positive of what you achieved rather than falling into bad blood with Andy Burnham. So maybe I should indulge my sunnier side and say, as you would say, Sam, there will be a nest of singing birds.
There will be bloodletting if we talk for any longer, and we have bust the limit. The alarm's gone off, so that's it for today. We'll be back tomorrow for Wednesday's Politics at Sam and always a nest of singing birds. See you then.
See you in the morning.
How does a banana trigger a CIA-backed coup? Do AirPods herald the arrival of a new global order? What do LED lights say about the future of humanity? I'm Ed Conway, and in each episode of my new podcast, Stuff Matters, I take an object, crack it open, and reveal the world-shaping forces hidden inside. This is economics told through the things we think we understand. Search Stuff Matters on your podcast app to listen and follow.